I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics, messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for February the 23rd, 2026. For certain, there are going to be a number of very important things we'll be covering later in the news roundup. Many of you have watched or you've seen various large snippets from the Tucker Carlson Mike Huckabee interview, and there's a lot of fallout coming from that. And of course, the tension continues to build in the Middle East regarding what is going to take place in Iran. The Gerald R. Ford strike group is fast approaching the Eastern Mediterranean. And I know with that, many people are expecting there to be some kind of a conflict activity in the coming days or weeks. So there are a lot of things we got to be keeping in prayer. When I have said in the past, we need to be praying for world peace, we need to be praying for world peace, even though I know that only Yeshua the Messiah can truly bring peace. All right, so in our theology roundup, we've been going through hold on. I've got some housekeeping items to go through first. I'm sorry. Please turn with me to the Messianic Apologetics website. Okay, there we go. Messianicapologetics.net. We do this on Mondays. Here in the right-hand column, you'll see blog notifications. Be automatically notified by email when Messianic Apologetics is updated. Be sure to add your email address there, hit subscribe, and you will be asked to confirm. So whenever we add something new or we repost something from our archives, you'll get an automatic notification for that. That is different than our email announcement list, which you can subscribe to by clicking on the envelope icon in the upper right-hand corner. That's a email announcement list with constant contact. Now, we did have something I have to talk about. This is from the weekend, and it pertained to our audio podcast. Of course, anybody who has been using the internet, social media for any period of time knows that some things from time to time don't work. And so with the audio podcast, so when this episode is completed, we'll have the audio podcast. Some services were working, some services were not working. All right. And here on the updates tab, if you hit podcast, you can click there. And of course, you can see this podcast player. The last episode is the Shabbat Shalom update from February the 21st. And you've got 50 episodes posted. I have added to this the RSS feed. So you can click the icon right there, and it'll say copied. Those of you who are technical know you can take that RSS feed and you can paste it into a podcast player. So, for example, if you're like me and you mostly use the Mac OS, iPhone, you should be able to post that RSS feed into the podcast player for the Mac OS, and the podcast will come right up. You don't have to wait for some of these other services. So just keep that in mind. But look, we try to stay on top of these different technical matters. A huge part of being in this ministry is making sure we are working and compliant with everything. Many people just think it's about Bible study and you being taught from the Word. Actually, a lot of it is logistics, and that can definitely come with its own level of stress and strain. Okay, on the theology roundup, since 2 weeks ago, Monday, we have been going through one law or one Torah theology. And by this time, you all know that I am not favorable to one law or one Torah theology. I believe that it has misdiagnosed and misapplied various Pentateuchal passages which use the terminology one law or one statute. Yet, that is not to say that I think that non-Jewish believers who have been supernaturally led by the Lord into the Messianic community as they have grown in the new covenant and convicted about things like Shabbat or the appointed times or a kosher style of diet, I am not telling them to stop and to leave. Universal Torah education was encouraged by all within the community of ancient Israel. A big part of what we're going to be discussing this week, not only reviewing some further issues I've got with One Torah, is whether or not there can be a viable alternative to it. And of course, there can be. And some of this is based in my experiences over the years with One Law, One Torah people, and some of their bad behavior. This study is something which is cumulative. Simply because one would say, no, I don't adhere to one law theology, doesn't mean that these are not important things for non-Jewish believers to consider as they grow in faith. Okay? So, not telling you all to leave the Messianic community or to stop things. I am telling you to be prepared to recalibrate some of your theology. Because once again, native and sojourner in ancient Israel, while not 100% or near 100% the same as one law tends to advocate, did have far more in common than not. And that is what we need to focus our attention on. So if you will turn back with me to the Messianic Apologetics website, be sure to click on the Articles tab, scroll down to the letter O, excuse me, and we've been going through this article, Approaching One Law Controversies, sorting through the legalism. A PDF file will open up, and this is where we left off on Friday as we discuss, as we review the Hebrew and now the Greek terms commonly associated with the sojourner. So on Friday, we talked about the ger, which would have been the sojourner in ancient Israel, and a great deal of contemporary Jewish theology and thought the ger was some kind of a formal proselyte to Judaism. That is not a position I would hold to. I don't believe that can be supported by the uses of ger. But many of the people in Messianic Judaism who might adhere to that position could conclude on the basis of how ger was rendered as proselutos in the Greek Septuagint that, well, speaking of a proselyte. So one of the things which has to be reviewed is whether or not there was a pre-Second Temple use of the term proselutos, meaning just a sojourner. And of course, later on, the term proselutos would, as it definitely would be seen in the Greek apostolic writings, the New Testament, to describe a formal proselyte to Judaism. And in recognizing that there can be flexibility in how certain terms, Hebrew, Greek, or even English, can mean one thing in one time period and then can mean something different in another time period, should not be a huge surprise. And what is one of the best examples of that in the English language? Well, 50 years ago, certainly 60 years ago, the term gay in the English language meant happy. Today, of course, the term gay means homosexual. Now, there's not that kind of stark difference between proselutos in an earlier period of Greek usage and then compared to what would be seen in more the New Testament. So just keep that in mind, because one of the things which today's, and I don't mean to rant on people too much, but today's Messianic community, its Greek skills tend to be very, very lacking at times. Huge amount of attention focused on Hebrew skills, being able to cant, being able to use Hebrew for liturgy, and that's all fine and good. But oftentimes, the Greek skills are just kind of left as an unnecessary appendage or an elective. And you have to have an ability in both. Is there a textual basis to support the idea that within ancient Israel, those who were to be afforded equal and fair treatment before the jurisprudence of the Torah were not native-born Israelites and sojourners, but instead native-born Israelites and those who had undergone the formal ritual of a proselyte. This could leave a third group, various non-Israelite, non-proselytes within the community, who should not have expected an equal and fair treatment in matters of Torah jurisprudence. Before examining how the ritual of a proselyte developed in Second Temple Judaism, we should acknowledge how there are commentators who, to some degree or another, would closely associate the role of the ger or sojourner and the later class of the proselyte to Judaism as being essentially identical. Referencing Exodus 12:48 and 49 in his Numbers commentary, the instructions on how to keep the Passover and how a ger circumcised could be reckoned as a native. Martin Note states this, quote, deals specifically with the right of participation in the Passover celebration, and that by stranger, ger, is meant someone who does not belong to the circle of fully privileged Israelites, but who yet, by acceptance of circumcision, has given himself to the service of the God of Israel, unquote. We have largely concurred with this conclusion in our previous examination of Exodus 12:48 and 49. But Note goes further, remarking that the ger who underwent circumcision, quote, is a proselyte in the terminology of a later period, unquote. And indeed, it is really not until one arrives in the much later rabbinical materials that the term ger is applied to a proselyte convert to Judaism from the Jastrow lexicon. Commenting later on Numbers 15, 1 through 16, it is clear how Note's conclusions are a bit clouded by his commitment to the critical tradition and Leviticus Numbers being the product of a so-called priestly writer many centuries removed from Moses. Quote, this would suggest that by strangers who sojourn with you is meant proselytes, i.e., people of non-Israelite origin who have attached themselves to the Jerusalem cult, unquote. From Martin Note. Okay, so two things I have to interject here. I'm sorry. Those of you all who are familiar with debates involving the composition of the Torah, the Pentateuch, there's the major school of thought which advocates that the Torah is a product of Mosaic origin. That doesn't mean that Moses was responsible for writing or composing every single letter or every single jot and tittle. Moses certainly did not write about his own death, the final chapter of Deuteronomy, but the Torah, a product of Mosaic oversight. Pentateuchal source criticism advocates that the Torah was composed of four main sources, JEDP, redacted together after the Babylonian exile. And so material, particularly dealing with the temple or the tabernacle priesthood, the Levites, various forms of ritual and what have you, mainly the material of Leviticus, also to a degree in Numbers, that would have been considered from the priestly source, P. Oh, and also, why do we say Martin Note and not Martin Noth? It's because Martin Note was German, and Pentateuchal source criticism first arose in Germany in the mid to late 19th century. That's why the J source, that was believed to represent uses of the divine name Yotevavhe, is represented by J, because in German the divine name is spelled with a Yot or J. Okay. Jacob Milgram, as a Jewish commentator and an adherent to the critical view as well, but probably less so than Note, is a bit more careful. He legitimately recognizes how within the Torah, quote, It must be remembered that the ger, the resident alien of biblical times, is a far remove from the ger, the convert of rabbinic times, unquote. Yet, examining how later centuries of Jewish tradition interpreted the Torah passages of a ger entering into Israel, he concludes, quote, the Jews of the 3rd century BCE were not in violation of the Torah, for by then they had reinterpreted the Torah's ger to denote the convert, unquote. He is most likely making reference to the fact that in the Greek Septuagint, ger is most frequently rendered as proselutos, from which we obviously get the English term proselyte. The different passages we have previously addressed from the Hebrew Torah are seen to have rendered ger with the Greek proselutos in the Septuagint. Okay, so those of you all who are familiar with the Greek Septuagint, you have an advantage over those who do not. So let's go through some of these passages. But if any guest should draw near to you, tis proselthe pros homos proselutos, to keep the Pascha, Passover, to the Lord. You shall circumcise every male of his, and then he shall draw near to keep it, and he shall be like a native of the land. No uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the local inhabitant and for the guest among you who has drawn near. Ta, proselthanti, proseluto, and humin. Exodus 12, 48 and 49, New English translation of the Septuagint. There shall be one judgment for the guest, to, proseluto, and for the inhabitant of the country. For it is I who am the Lord your God. Leviticus 24:22, New English translation of the Septuagint. Now, if a guest comes to you, proselthe, pros homos, proselutos, and your land, he also shall keep the Pascha, Passover to the Lord, according to the law of the Pascha and according to its organization. So shall he keep it. There shall be one law for you and for the guest, to proseluto, and for the native of the land. Numbers 9:14, New English translation, the Septuagint. One law shall be for you and for the guests, tois proselutois, who associate themselves among you, an everlasting law for your generations, as you are, also the guests shall be before the Lord. There shall be one law and one statute for you and for the guest, ta proseluto, who attaches himself to you. Numbers 15, 15, and 16, New English translation of the Septuagint. And finally, for the local inhabitant among Israel's sons, and for the guest who associates himself among them, to proseluto, to proskemeno, and altois, there shall be one law for them. Whoever might have acted unintentionally, and a soul that shall act with a hand of arrogance from the natives or from the guests, ton proseluton, this one provokes God. That soul, shall be completely destroyed from his people. Numbers 15, 29, and 30, New English translation of the Septuagint. Okay, and because we've just reviewed those passages again, if you need to, please go back in our study, because this study is cumulative. And I would remind some of you, I have not concluded that in the specific places where one law or one statute is used, it was speaking of universal Torah, as in the Chumash, the Pentateuch as a whole being referred to. Instead, one law, lowercase l, was speaking of specific legislation where a sojourner could have been taken advantage of over against a native in ancient Israel. And so the argument of some is that, well, because the Septuagint here rendered ger as proselutos, the one to be shown fair treatment in Torah jurisprudence had to be a formal proselyte to Judaism. We're here to challenge some of that, mainly because of a pre-Second Temple usage of proselutos. But no, these passages are not speaking of universal Torah. They're speaking of specific legislation. In the first century period, when the Greek-speaking Jewish community would read proselutos from the Septuagint, it would most likely be understood in terms of someone who had gone through the formal process of becoming a convert to Judaism, like a Greek or Roman in their midst could have done. The first century BCE Jewish philosopher Philo expressed his view of how Moses called those who crossed into the community of Israel, quote unquote, proselytes. Okay. And these last he calls proselytes, proselutos, from the fact of their having come over, proselythenai, to a new and God-fearing constitution, learning to disregard the fabulous inventions of other nations and clinging to unalloyed truth. From Special Laws 151. There should be no question that many of those Greeks and Romans who became proselytes to ancient Judaism before the arrival of Yeshua were good people who made the right choice. Becoming proselytes enabled them to completely cut themselves off from a paganism which had once kept them in darkness and ignorant of the one true God. It kept them devoted and anchored to a community of people who were chosen to represent the goodness of the Creator to the nations. Okay. The question, which does not often get asked, though, is whether the Septuagint translators, 2 to 3 centuries before the ministry of Yeshua, actually intended proselutos to mean a formal convert to Judaism. When proselutos appears in the apostolic scriptures, Matthew 23:15, Acts 2:11, 6:5, 13:43, a formal convert to ancient Judaism is intended. However, there are some terms which appear in the Greek Septuagint, though, which do not always correspond to later meanings witnessed in the Greek New Testament. And indeed, you have to keep that in mind for the development of any language. The term proselutos can have a different meaning in the Greek Septuagint from its usage in the Greek Apostolic Scriptures, New Testament, given the 3 centuries between them. The Liddell Scott lexicon, that's the intermediate one, primarily interested in classical uses, actually has one that has arrived at a place, a sojourner, as its first definition of proselutos. The Thayer lexicon has its first definition of proselutos as a stranger, alien, noting how it is the frequent Septuagint rendering for ger. The noted lexicographer Frederick W. Danker, that's the D in the BDAG lexicon, details that literally proselutos is one who has arrived at a place, therefore a stranger, from Baker's Dictionary of Theology, and then discusses the later development of the proselytization process in Second Temple Judaism. The correspondence of the Greek proselutos as a kind of sojourner or traveler, just as the Hebrew ger was, aligns with the related verb proserkomai, simply meaning to move towards, from the BDAG lexicon. The New English translation of the Septuagint, in the passages we have focused upon, actually renders proselutos as guest. So, is it at all possible for proselutos in the Greek Septuagint to mean something other than a formal convert proselyte to Judaism, as proselutos is used in the apostolic scriptures? In the estimation of at least one scholar, David M. Moffat of Duke University, 2009, previous lexicographers and interpreters have largely had to only consult the Septuagint, Philo's works, and the New Testament to derive the theological meaning of proselutos. He acknowledges, quote, in the context of early Judaism, the word ger plainly was applied to Jewish converts. Additionally, the term proselutos, bears the meaning convert in Hellenistic Jewish texts from the 1st century CE. By the end of the Second Temple period, proselutos and probably ger could refer to converts to Judaism, unquote. Yet, he does issue a stern caution about how far back this can be pushed. Quote, whether or not one can conclude that those translating the Septuagint centuries earlier rendered ger as proselutos because they already understood ger to mean convert is a different question entirely. Excuse me, unquote. He goes on to describe how within the archives at Duke, a 3rd century BCE manuscript fragment, P. Duke INV 727, has demonstrated a non-religious secular usage of proselutos to simply designate foreigners or sojourners, in this case, those participating in a monetary transaction. The main conclusion of Moffat regarding this fragmentary evidence is, now I'm going to have to correct myself because I had Moffat with one T there. Quote, this is a draft of a legal document. Corrections in a second hand are evident throughout, addressing some kind of transaction and or dispute. Second, the date and location of the papyrus indicates that the text comes from roughly the time period in which the first portion of the Septuagint was translated in Alexandria. That is to say, the papyrus proves that the word proselutos was in use in Egypt around the time that the Torah was translated into Greek, unquote. While more research and investigation into proselutos needs to be conducted, it is becoming likely that prior to the popularization of the Septuagint in Greek-speaking Jewish communities, and with terms taking on a more theological focus, that a word like proselutos originally had a neutral meaning for those in Ptolemaic Egypt. Proselutos simply meaning a sojourner or resident without any sense of implying a formal convert to Judaism would certainly be implied by the Septuagint uses, which describe Israel as being a sojourning or a so-called proselyte nation in Egypt. Exodus 22:20 or 21, depending on your Septuagint version, 23:9, Leviticus 19:34, Deuteronomy 10:9. All right, now we've just discussed proselutos as likely having a neutral usage as just a sojourner, a foreigner in the period of the Septuagint. Later on, of course, for Second Temple Judaism, it would have taken on the context of a formal convert to Judaism. Moving ahead to the broad 1st century BCE or CE period, what would it have actually meant for a Greek or Roman person to become a Jewish proselyte? Is the proselytization procedure actually outlined in the Pentateuch or derived from it? Is it something which was intended all the way back at Mount Sinai, or is it the reflection of later generations of Jews wishing to closely preserve their ethnicity and protect their people from outside assimilation? There is no agreement as to when real proselytes started emerging on the scene within Second Temple Judaism. The range of opinions one may encounter express the views that a procedure for becoming a proselyte goes back to not just figures like the Moabitess Ruth, but is indicated by the Dictionary of Judaism in the biblical period. Quote, many of the sages favored accepting converts into the community, describing Abraham as the first Jew to seek converts and teaching that all Jews should follow his lead by attempting to win over Gentiles to the worship of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Yet, in this Entry's estimation, quote, the Bible, meaning the Tanakh, does not have a concept of conversion. The idea arose around the 1st century CE, unquote. The references Scott McKnight provides on favorable attitudes toward proselytes in his entry for the Dictionary of New Testament Background all come from the broad 1st century BCE CE and the time immediately after. So you can look in the footnote here for some of those references. He also indicates how, quote, the evidence from antiquity reveals a rather diverse set of requirements that differ from time and place, so that it is no longer accurate to speak of Judaism requiring circumcision, baptism or immersion, and a sacrifice in the temple, unquote. His thought is, quote, all Jews would have expected repentance, obedience, and social integration into the Jewish community if one wanted to become a proselyte, unquote. But the degrees of how fast or slow this took place were varied. The main summary of what was required for ancient proselytes to Judaism is actually seen in the Talmud. So this is from later, but just as your forefathers entered the covenant only with circumcision and immersion and sprinkling of blood through the sacrifices, so they will enter the covenant only through circumcision, immersion, and sprinkling of blood on the altar. Keritot 9a. It is very true that each one of these elements is seen in the Torah, so it was not unreasonable for the ancient sages to have placed them together as the main components of what would have frequently constituted proselytization. Those in the diaspora would have probably made some kind of monetary offering in place of a sacrifice. But again, when did these procedures really take on significance and force? Not in the Exodus. The discussions about proselytes to ancient Judaism largely occurred contemporary to the ministry of Yeshua. Of all the elements listed, circumcision of males would have been the most important, and history certainly bears out the close association between circumcision and Jewish proselytes, especially given the tenor of Paul's letter to the Galatians. Most critically, not to be overlooked, would be how circumcision was made illegal on threat of death during the Maccabean crisis of the 2nd century BCE. 1 Maccabees 1, 60 and 61, 2 Maccabees 6:10. The Pentateuch itself specifically required circumcision of the ger to eat the Passover sacrifice, Exodus 12, 48 and 49, which in turn resulted in native of the land status being afforded. The Pentateuch defined a people whose God had delivered them via the Exodus and his judgments on Egypt. After the Maccabean crisis of the 2nd century BCE, though, something like circumcision easily took on a significantly nationalistic interest for the Jewish people and was a bit overextended at that, something although entirely understandable, as many had fought and died for it. While outsiders had always been allowed into the community of either ancient Israel or Second Temple Judaism, the fallout of the Maccabean crisis really would have forced the issue of how it was to formally take place, especially as the Jewish people would have been most concerned with maintaining their ethnic cohesion and resisting much of the surrounding Hellenism and Romanism. Quickly, being circumcised was synonymous with being Jewish. Its significance became much inflated, beyond that of being the memorial sign of the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 17:10. In McKnight's estimation, quote, circumcision as a conversion ritual becomes confused with how Jews perceive the nation. The act and national identity are not easy to separate, unquote. Dictionary of New Testament Background. He makes a reference from Josephus to a Roman general named Metilius, caught in battle. For when he entreated for mercy and promised that he would turn Jew and be circumcised, they saved him alive. Wars of the Jews, 17, 454. What were the social ramifications of becoming a Jewish proselyte in the Second Temple era? Some of them were quite good, because Yeshua's word to Nicodemus, unless one is born again, John 3:3, was appropriated directly from how a proselyte who had turned his back on paganism was thought to be like a newborn baby. Talmud Yevamot 48b. Now something true of the Messiah's followers. At the same time, it was not always easy for those of the period who wanted to proselytize to do so. Josephus recorded a scene of a king Izates, ruler of Adia Bene, who was converted to Judaism via the teaching of the Jewish merchant Ananias. Izates had first seen how his mother eagerly embraced Judaism, and then he followed. He stopped short, though, of undergoing circumcision, as if his subjects heard of it, Izates' life might be in danger. The record indicates how Ananias agreed on how undergoing circumcision would be life-threatening and how God would forgive him for this oversight. Antiquities of the Jews 20, 38-42. The further record does indicate, however, how Izates went through with the rite. Antiquities of the Jews 20, 43-48. We should never think that all Jews of the first century CE had a rigid view of circumcision, actually placing circumcision status ahead of belief in God. McKnight concurs, quote, "There were dissenting voices at different times for special reasons," unquote. Dictionary of New Testament Background. For a season between the Maccabean crisis and the arrival of Yeshua the Messiah, the making of many Greek and Roman proselytes was a good thing, especially given some of the criticism levied against them by their own people, laced with anti-Semitism, i.e. Tacitus's The Histories 5.5, Juvenal Satires 1495-104. Yet at the same time, how much paranoia and xenophobia were present within the Jewish world, at least in the land of Israel, given the presence of the Roman occupation, the Essenes secluded off to themselves, readying for the final battle, various zealot groups and uprisings, and the two major schools of Pharisees. Given how the Maccabean crisis had promoted Hellenistic integration and assimilation, to what degree would Greek and Roman proselytes to the synagogue be truly welcomed into the Jewish community and not treated with some suspicion? Philo's observation was that it took 3 generations for proselytes to really become Jews. On the Virtues 108, and we are probably all familiar with the classic example of Shammai, who refused to teach a non-Jew the Torah on one foot, versus Hillel, who taught him to do no harm to neighbor. Talmud Shabbat 31a. In the first century world of Yeshua and the apostles, we are probably safe to think how the proselyte procedure in various degrees was quite rigorous, involving much more than the specified circumcision, immersion, and sacrifice. Excuse me. Some significant education and some social scrutiny by the Jewish community the proselyte would enter into came along with the package. So why did the apostles frequently oppose new, non-Jewish believers becoming proselytes? Surely it would not have been over simply being circumcised, immersed in water, and then at least giving alms. These were all features of the Torah, even if the formula together was not specified. The main reason circumcision of the new, non-Jewish believers was often opposed in the apostolic scriptures, New Testament, had nothing to do with it being a Torah-prescribed practice. Those Greeks and Romans who were already proselytes to Judaism before hearing about Yeshua and the good news, Acts 2:10, 6:5, 13:43, and who genuinely became believers were accepted as is. This was done on a circumstantial basis, though. The main reason why circumcision of any more non-Jewish believers was opposed was because of the sociological factors surrounding it. There were precedents in the post-Maccabean Jewish history, for example, of forced conversions. McKnight summarizes how, quote, Hyrcanus, Aristobulus I, and Alexander Jannaeus each forced Gentiles to convert and be circumcised, even if they saw such as part of an eschatological program or political purgation, unquote. Dictionary of New Testament background. Forcing or ordering any believers to do things ran entirely contrary to Yeshua's teaching. Okay, let me pause there for a moment, because there is, of course, the issue of the circumcision of Timothy in Acts 16. But that likewise is a circumstantial issue, because Timothy was the son of a Jewish mother and Greek father. And because Timothy was already half Jewish, Timothy was in this kind of like in between zone. Are you Jewish? Are you Greek? And so it was expedient for Timothy, who was ethnically Jewish in part, to go ahead and be circumcised. But Titus, of course, who was fully Greek, was not circumcised. So he did not have to go through some kind of ritual proselyte procedure to be welcomed in as a full believer. All right, let's get back to this. Forcing or ordering any believers to do things ran entirely contrary to Yeshua's teaching. When he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all the truth. John 16:13, New American Standard. The common focus of identity for Messiah followers was to be his sacrificial work and the ongoing activity of the Holy Spirit he promised to send to then guide individuals' lives. All obedience to the Lord and his commandments was to come via the compulsion of his presence inside of human vessels, not demanding mortals. This was not what a group of hyper-conservative Pharisees advocated. It is necessary to circumcise them and to order them to keep the law of Moses. Acts 15:5, English Standard Version. We see an opposition to proselyte circumcision, which was against the will of the Spirit. Acts 15:8, mainly because it would give quarter to or would help feed the widespread and errant idea in much of Second Temple Judaism that Jewish ethnicity guaranteed one eternal redemption. The Mishnah includes the sentiment, all Israelites have a share in the world to come. Sanhedrin 10:1, and in order to be a true Israelite in this sense, an outsider had to be circumcised as a proselyte. But the way true inclusion within God's people has always been assured has been via faithful trust in him. Genesis 15:6, Galatians 3:6. Faith in Israel's Messiah reckoned the non-Jewish believers a part of God's own, Galatians 3:9, and was to be the common denominator of unity and cohesion. The apostles would also, have nothing to do with the common occurrence of a Jewish proselyte having to pray, God of your fathers, Mishnah Bikurim 1:4, in a public service. Paul strongly asserted in 1 Corinthians 10:1, for I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. New American Standard. This was written to a mixed Corinthian assembly of Jewish and non-Jewish believers who were to view the heritage of God's Torah as their own, although for the latter, it could only be viewed as a part of their spiritual heritage. This is especially true in recognizing that what occurred to ancient Israel in the wilderness was written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. 1 Corinthians 10:11, New American Standard. In the thought of Richard B. Hayes, at least, quote, the story of Israel is for the Gentile Corinthians, not somebody else's story. It is the story of their own authentic spiritual ancestors, unquote. All Messiah followers are to use the discernment granted to them by God's Spirit to know how to properly approach and apply the messages of his Torah. Paul's thrust in his letters was largely the reconciliation of all human beings in one body to God through the cross, Ephesians 2:16, New American Standard, and not a group of Jews and proselytes on one side and everyone else on another. But while he is negative toward non-Jewish believers becoming proselytes, Yeshua the Messiah himself was even more so in his evaluation of what the first century proselyte-making process had largely become in his day. Among his direct words to the Pharisaical leaders included, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." Matthew 23:15, New American Standard. The Lord actually did say that many proselytes were twice as fit for Gehinnom as you are. Complete Jewish Bible. We should not forget how there were many intramural debates among the different sects of Pharisees within Second Temple Judaism, which often used very stern and tough language, which would not be found in academic or theological debate today. What is seen in Matthew 23:15 is really, really bad, though. It cannot be disputed that Huion Geanes or Ben Gehinnom, Salkinson Ginsburg, Hebrew New Testament, is something most severe, being associated with the place of final damnation. So, yeah, that's the terminology, Huion Geanes or Ben Gehinnom, right? Associated with the place of final damnation. Being a child of hell, New Revised Standard English Standard Version, really is a much worse designation than just being, as we might encounter in more modern speech, a son of a bitch, as insulting as that is. It is a testament to how much of the proselyte making process had gone sour and putrid. The observation of Craig S. Keener is, quote, presumably by exposing converts to the truth of God's standards while allowing hypocrisy through their own bad example, 23:13, that's from Matthew. These Pharisees were leading their own converts to be doubly damned, unquote. Becoming a Jewish proselyte, as beneficial as it had probably been for previous persons, was not necessary in the first century Messianic community. Being instructed from God's Torah would be important, but it would be done with the Messiah's teachings and example in mind, which would guide the way via the unique and distinct presence of the Holy Spirit. Non-Jewish believers the world over since, including the theological background and traditions found in my own family, have widely looked to being guided by the Ten Commandments and the Law of Moses, certainly in an effort to follow the ethical and moral teachings of our Lord and Savior. With the arrival of today's Messianic movement on the scene of history, this is being accomplished with many more elements in mind, and with many of us eagerly awaiting the full restoration of Israel and God's kingdom. So, to briefly summarize, okay, going back, and again, this is a cumulative study we've been going through. The instructions pertaining to one law or one statute did not speak of universal Torah, the Chumash, the Pentateuch as a whole. It rather was speaking of one law, lowercase l, and places where the sojourner could have been taken advantage of over against the native. The Septuagint did render ger as proselutos, but you don't see the term proselutos meaning a formal convert proselyte to Judaism until later. Early on, in the period of the Septuagint, earlier on, proselutos had a neutral meaning of just a sojourner. In the period of the Apostolic Scriptures, we see that while immediately earlier, post-Maccabean crisis, many Greeks and Romans becoming formal convert proselytes, circumcised as convert proselytes, was a good thing. Paul was very negative to the process because, after all, he believed that The focus of one's faith was to be the completed work of Yeshua. Faith in God reckoned you as a member of God's own, extended to trust in what Yeshua had accomplished. And Yeshua himself was very negative to the proselyte procedure, saying that it had produced many children of hell. Today, of course, in the Messianic community, there was some discussion on this on Facebook earlier before I got started. There are some in various sectors of the Messianic Jewish community who believe that they can offer a proselyte conversion procedure for non-Jewish believers. I have never been in a Messianic Jewish congregation where it was believed, number one, that's necessary, and secondly, the Messianic Jews I associate with would say that is a rabbinical convention. Our unity is to be predicated on being one new man, one new humanity, and our faith in the completed work, the completed sacrifice of Yeshua on the tree. So, and they would recognize along with that various uses of circumcision, particularly in parts of Galatians and Romans, it wasn't so much speaking of a medical operation, but the ritual of someone becoming a Jewish convert, a Greek or a Roman becoming a convert to Judaism. Okay, now, if you want to know more about some of this, you can go to the Messianic Apologetics website, messianicapologetics.net. You can look at the article we've got, Is Circumcision for Everyone? That goes beyond the scope of what we are addressing today. You can also address the frequently asked question entry on circumcision. We've got a back episode where we went through that. We did that in the fall. So I recommend you look at that information. Tomorrow, we're going to be hopefully wrapping this One Law, One Torah theology series up on Friday. What are we going to talk about? Sorting through the legalism. Because after all, one of the reasons we're here to discuss this isn't just to review the specific passages which employ one law or one statute, convert, ger, proselyte, all this. We have to also review, because apologetics is defense of the faith, we have to review some of the philosophy, ideology, and bad fruit of the one law, one Torah sub-movement. Why do I not identify as one law, one Torah? Why do I not associate with some of the people who identify as one law, one Torah? And why do they not associate with me? We're going to be getting into some of that in the rest of our study. Okay. That concludes our theology roundup for today. Now let's move on to the news roundup. And we do the news roundup after the theology roundup because the news is time sensitive. It changes from day to day. And what are some of the big stories we're focusing in on right now? Well, some of you all have doubtlessly seen, if not in total, you've seen significant clips from the Tucker Carlson, Mike Huckabee interview. Likewise, we've got building tension in the Middle East with Iran. Very soon, the Gerald R. Ford strike group will be in the Eastern Mediterranean, and about a third of the active U.S. Navy is in the region right now. Before we got started, I saw, per the whole Epstein issue, that Peter Mandelson, he was a member of the Tony Blair government, also a former UK ambassador to the United States. He had been arrested. So we're not going to be getting into that today, but doubtlessly there'll be some stories about that we'll review tomorrow. And one of the big questions I've got, why do we not see more people in today's Messianic community, in particular in positions of leadership and teaching, talking more about some of these situations? We've also got some anti-Semitic stories we got to go through, which I'm not happy about. Now, I can't speak universally. I don't know what goes on at your Messianic congregation or synagogue, what's discussed, what's not talked about. But we are living in very significantly changing times. And while we do not want to be presumptuous, as many people were around the turn of the millennium, and they were all discredited, and no offense, a lot of them were expecting some kind of a 6,000 year return of Yeshua the Messiah. We should all know by now that that concept needs to be jettisoned. It's not true. Nevertheless, we are admonished by Yeshua and his Olivet Discourse to be paying attention to socio-religious, political signs, which will be increasing in fervency as we get closer to his return. And when we see things like an impending war in the Middle East, an impending conflict in the Middle East, when we see people out there, saying, and we got to get into this later, I'm a hyper supersessionist like Joel Webbin. I just got his book. I'll reference it again. The Hyphenated Heresy. I got this in the mail over the weekend. And they are influencing young men in particular, and possibly young men, who once were in the Messianic sphere of influence. We can't be silent. We can't say, oh, this will blow over, or if it gets bad enough, the Lord will rapture us out of here. I mean, come on. This affects us in our situation on the ground today. So, number one, be praying for peace, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. Number two, and Iran. Number two, be praying for peace, Russia, Ukraine. Number three, reason and sanity here on the American home front and in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so all the news stories I'm about to go through, you'll be able to look at these later today when this episode is archived at messianicapologetics.net. Oh, and I have something else I'd like to go through for you. I forgot to do this when we got started because we had to discuss the issue of the audio podcast. So if you'll go to Messianic Apologetics, we'll do this really quickly. Okay, so scroll down to the last episode of Messianic Insiders. So this is from the 20th of February. Of course, you can click here and it'll come right up. Okay, scroll down just a moment. Okay, here. See this little player right here? You can listen to the audio of the podcast just by clicking play right there. And of course, you got the YouTube immediately underneath it. And likewise, you got a link to the stream on X, formerly Twitter. So there are some redundancies built into whether it's the live stream, the video, or the audio. So there are multiple ways you can access this. Okay, so our first story, and this is from Ambassador Mike Huckabee on X. He was formerly the governor of Arkansas. This is his response to the interview that he had with Nick Fuentes, posted on February the 21st, 7:39 a.m., so Saturday morning, basically. He mentions what some of the things Tucker Carlson said about Ashkenazi Jews, the DNA of Jews, whether or not they need to be tested with DNA. Talked about how I don't know where Tucker Carlson got some of these ideas, because he also mentioned the Khazar theory, which is that Ashkenazi Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, were a Turkic people who converted to Judaism. They're not native to the Middle East. Mentions conspiracy theories, all of this. And this was Ambassador Huckabee's response. When I sat down with Tucker Carlson on Wednesday, I was expecting a thoughtful conversation and that he would ask questions and give me the opportunity to actually respond, just like he did with the little Nazi sympathizer Nick Fuentes, or the guy who thought that Hitler was the good guy and Churchill the bad guy. What I wasn't anticipating was a lengthy series of questions where he seemed to be insinuating that the Jews of today aren't really the same people as the Jews of the Bible. So, Ashkenazi Jews not being authentic descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He mentions neo-Nazis and some of these other things. You can all read through that at a later time. But we've got to be aware of this, because I remember years ago getting involved in the Messianic community, and even up until now, these are the kinds of things which people in Messianic Jewish congregations and leadership, they know they're these conspiracy theories, they know they're false, that are out there. All of my Messianic Jewish friends, all of them are Ashkenazic, right? They all have ancestry going back to Central and Eastern Europe. One of them even immigrated to the United States from the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. You would know it. She doesn't have an accent, but the point is that Messianic leaders, Messianic Jewish people, they know about this, but when it comes up, they just kind of like to put it off to the side. And yes, I know this is infuriating. I know it's upsetting. I know it gets people going. It gets me going. But if we don't acknowledge that, hey, Tucker Carlson, who was reliable at one point in his career as a journalist and as a commentator, he's fallen for all this crap. If we are not able to, in our Messianic congregations and synagogues, say, hey, there's this stuff out there, and let me, as the congregational leader, the rabbi, tell you why it's false. How many people in the vacuum of not saying anything, the vacuum of not saying that, look, there was no genocide in Gaza. Compare the conflict in Gaza, which is a disaster, by the way, to other conflicts, and it's night and day. If we do not mention some of these things, how many people who have been attending the Messianic community, be a part of the Messianic community for a while, are going to leave? Okay, we're never going to convince Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or Nick Fuentes of the truth. But if we don't raise the awareness in our sphere of influence, some people will be caught unaware and they'll go off, because this isn't just about theology. It's about a spiritual war. It's about the salvation of Israel and the Jewish people. That's, Yeshua is returning to Jerusalem. He is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And things are going to get more and more complicated as we approach the Messiah's return. And if, various Messianic congregational leaders and teachers are afraid, or more likely they think this is just inconvenient, it interrupts their teaching series or it interrupts with what's interested to them, people like me have to be raised up to raise awareness. And look, we're going to be having to mention this thing constantly now, because more and more people are lobbing onto it. And do I know specifically how we're going to address every single aspect of it? No, any more than any of us can know how to address every single aspect of what people claim against the Bible, against Yeshua, Jesus, what have you. Okay, so here's another response to the Tucker Carlson, Mike Huckabee interview. This is from Laura Loomer. And this specifically, there's a clip, 2 minutes, 2 seconds. U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, did a great job dispelling the fake claims spewed by Tucker Carlson, as she calls him, that the United States gets no return on its investment into Israel. Okay, and I'll read the quotation in just a moment. But there are a lot of people out there who, they know that the Khazar thing regarding Ashkenazic Jews, that's a load, and that even, look, Israel was very specific in its targeting of different tunnels, different terrorists in its conflict in Gaza. But still, they're like, I'm America first. Yes, I support Israel, but I also believe in responsible economics, and we need to cut back on all the foreign aid we're sending to other countries, including the almost $4 billion which goes to Israel. And the Israelis know this is an issue too. And it goes back to the 1979 peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. But there is the frequent claim that support money, which goes from the United States to Israel, it then gets funneled into, well, this is why Israel has got free healthcare. We don't have free healthcare here in America. It goes to funneling abortion in Israel. I mean, all this kind of stuff. Mike Huckabee's response to Tucker Carlson was very useful to clarify some of this. But let's talk about that for a minute. $3.8 billion a year. That money goes right back to the U.S. to purchase weapon systems. For example, every round of ammo that the IDF shoots is manufactured just outside where I live in Little Rock, Arkansas. A lot of the components for the Iron Dome and the Arrow 3 missile defense systems are manufactured near Camden, Arkansas. So, one of the main things which doesn't often get the traction it should is that U.S. aid to the state of Israel, almost $4 billion a year, it goes right back into the U.S. economy. It goes right back into, yes, various defense industries, but it's very restricted in terms of what it can be spent on. It can't be spent on some of the social services of the state of Israel. Okay, here's our next story. This is from Visegrad 24, and there's kind of a video, and it also includes the exiled crown prince of Iran. The Islamic regime in Iran, this is from, excuse me, the 21st of February, is so weak and desperate that it has to import over 5,000 militias that are not Iranian nationals to carry out the massacre. They are from Lebanon, Palestine, Afghanistan, says Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi in an exclusive interview with Visegrad 24. So that's a useful clip to keep in mind. When a government has to specifically import others to help fight for it. I mean, some of us know, even in our American history, during the American Revolution, the British had to hire Hessian mercenaries. Right, they were German, and that was one of the reasons why there was such a success on the Christmas Day crossing of the Delaware by George Washington. The Hessians were drunk, they were speaking German, they couldn't easily understand the orders of their British superiors, and George Washington and his forces took advantage of all that. But, countries which have to import those from other countries in order to fight, in this case, for their presumed survival, what does that say about the quality of the regime? Shouldn't you have more people who are, Iranian Islamic patriots who, want to stand up for the Ayatollah and what he's doing? Okay, here's another article. This is from the Jerusalem Post from the 21st of February. Tucker Carlson accuses Huckabee of prioritizing Israel in combative Ben Gurion airport interview. And the byline, the conservative commentator accused U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee of working for Israel during a recent interview at the Ben Gurion airport. So this is a useful article for you to look through that summarizes a lot of what is was seen in the interview. And there was a lot of aspects of this interview. We're focusing on some of the things which really stuck out to me. Now, one of the things I think we have to be aware of regarding this interview is that this kind of an interview is a barometer regarding how the feeling of many people in the United States has changed post October the 7th, 2023. And how, while there is still very strong support for Israel, whether it's on a biblical basis or some other kind of basis seen in the United States, it has dropped. And it's going to continue to drop, whether we like it or not. Is Donald Trump the last Zionist president? I hope not, but we have to wait and see what's going to come next. But look, if you believe that you're part of the Messianic movement as the end time move of God, none of this is a huge surprise. None of this is a huge shock. All right, from 2CTV, February the 21st, 10:16 a.m., so this would have been on Saturday. Shopping centers and petrol stations in Iran, and there's a 2-minute, 48-second clip, are packed as civilians stock up on essentials. Some are taping windows, a precaution used during the Iran-Iraq War, which, of course, was from the 1980s. Meanwhile, protests continue despite the recent crackdown. Crowds have again taken to the streets chanting against the regime. So the pressure is building. All right, from Fox News, and here's a headline. You can look at the article in its entirety later. The headline, potential U.S. military strikes on Iran could target specific individuals, pursue regime change, report. The byline, President Donald Trump said Friday he is considering a limited military strike on Iran to pressure Tehran into a deal over its nuclear program. And so we know this is the kind of information which changes from day to day. One of the scenarios is that the president wants to enact maximum pressure upon the Iranian regime, give them a maximum amount of time to be like, okay, Ayatollah, the current government, we'll cut a deal with you. You all go into exile and turn your country over to the people. I mean, that's one scenario. The other scenario is limited strikes, pressure them to make an agreement, which is going to be really hard for them to make. Others would be some level of strikes to give the people in Iran the necessary boost they need to overthrow the Islamic Republic. I mean, these are all the things which are out there. We don't know what's going to happen because it changes day to day. I mean, we know that it's been announced that on the 28th, so that would be this coming Saturday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is supposed to be going to Israel. Of course, that could change very quickly. And we go day to day with the pressure on the Iranian regime. Fox News from X, February the 21st, 1017. There's a 1 minute, 27-second clip. Significant air campaign. Fox News senior strategic analyst General Jack Keane, retired, tells Kayleigh McEnany, the pieces are moving into place that could set the conditions for a regime change inside Iran. So here it's significant air campaign, right? We've kind of heard all of the different scenarios. And what other scenarios have we not heard? Rewind back to the beginning of the year we saw that there were building U.S. forces in the South Caribbean, north of Venezuela, including the Gerald R. Ford strike group, which is now being relocated to the Eastern Mediterranean. We woke up on Saturday morning to hear that Nicolas Maduro had been apprehended. All kinds of scenarios. And the members of the Gerald R. Ford strike group, they're going to the Middle East now with that combat experience. So we have to keep that in mind. Okay. So our next story, and this is it's from Open Source Intel, posting a clip from Fox News, 39 seconds, 2:35 a.m., February the 22nd. Steve Witkoff. The president is curious as to why Iran hasn't capitulated. Why, under this pressure, with the amount of naval power over there, haven't they come to us and said, we profess we don't want a weapon? So, yeah, these are the kinds of factors which are being weighed into a potential military action. All right, so we definitely know that there's a lot of responses, blowback from the recent Tucker Carlson, Mike Huckabee interview. And this is one of the big areas where there is some blowback. So this came across my feed on X. It's from Zero Hedge. Zero Hedge, it's not quite right-wing fringe, but it's about 2 or 3 stone throws away from it. But from time to time, I will pass on something from Zero Hedge. The headline, this is from February the 21st, Saturday. Ambassador Huckabee claims Israel has biblical right to conquer whole Middle East. Okay. We know that Mike Huckabee, before he became governor of Arkansas, he was a Southern Baptist minister, and he definitely believes that the founding of the state of Israel was according to Bible prophecy. Everyone in the Messianic community believes that. But here, and you can go into this and read the article in its entirety. There's some other posts we got to go through. He believes that Israel, based on the original Abrahamic promise, has a biblical right to conquer territory involving not only what is called contemporarily as the Gaza Strip, Judea and Samaria, but parts of Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, etc. Some of you all have seen the map of quote unquote Greater Israel, which basically includes a big giant chunk of the Middle East. And he seemingly agrees with that conclusion. Now, before we get into some of these other responses, everyone should recognize that the borders of the current state of Israel are not the biblical borders of the Promised Land. The Promised Land is bigger than the current state of Israel. Whether it includes territory going all the way to Kuwait and huge chunks of Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and all this, that can be questioned. And it should be questioned. Okay, so we'll get back to that in a moment. From open source intel yesterday, 6:14 a.m., and there's a 59-second clip. This is a little more important, I think. Netanyahu unveils plans for a new Mediterranean Middle East alliance to counter radical Shiite and Sunni axes. Netanyahu, the vision is to build a strategic alliance across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, linking India, Arab states, African partners, Greece, Cyprus, and additional Asian countries. The goal is a unified bloc that sees the region clearly and stands in direct opposition to both the radical Shiite axis and the radical Sunni axis. And of course, you know that recently the state of Israel acknowledged Somaliland as an independent country. And part of that is because Somaliland exists on one of those strategic sea lanes leading up into the Red Sea. So we see right now Israel, the state of Israel, trying to recognize Somaliland. It's trying to improve its relations with the United Arab Emirates, with countries like Greece, Cyprus, India. The Indian Prime Minister is expected soon, this week, I believe, to make a visit to Israel. So, I mean, that's pretty significant. And how much of that is going to offset? I mean, even if you see the Islamic Republic of Iran replaced with a constitutional monarchy, a democratic republic, there are going to be other players who then shift things around too. Saudi Arabia, Qatar. I mean, Syria, what's going to happen? Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, what's going to happen? This is the kind of thing which some people would read specific messages into the Bible. Others like me say, let this play out, but it is going to affect us just the same, because while we are taking some steps toward the second coming of Yeshua, in the short term, what happens in the Middle East affects the global economy. It affects things like the price at the pump. It affects overall stability in the markets. So we've got short-term things to keep in mind as well as longer-term things to keep in mind. Okay, here is a very important post on Instagram from the Jerusalem Report. This is the kind of stuff your Messianic congregational leader, your rabbi, your prayer team has got to be mentioning on a regular basis before your congregation. And I'm going to say this very directly. If these kinds of things are not being mentioned on a regular basis before your congregation, your leader is not doing his or her job, because this is something we've got to pay attention to as a Messianic faith community. America's Israel alliance is breaking. Here's why. And the description is, the U.S.-Israel relationship is at a crossroads. Okay, the largest Messianic community is where? It's in the United States of America. Despite strong cooperation under Trump, 53% of Americans view Israel unfavorably. Okay, and here you see how it deals with both the right as well as the left. Key Democratic pillars, including Jewish supporters, have shifted toward escalating criticism and calls for aid cuts. Some Republicans echo isolationist opposition to foreign aid. This convergence could block legislation Israel needs, while the rift between American Jews and Israel keeps deepening. Whoa. So, yeah, if you are not talking about this on a semi-regular basis, your congregational leadership, not just in prayer, oh Lord, we pray for Israel, their protection, blah, blah. No, we know that the relationship between Israel and the United States has altered since October the 7th, the Gaza conflict, the 12-day war, and what is going to come from the current Iranian situation. You've got to talk about this. You can't have people in positions of leadership and influence asleep at the wheel. And I'm not trying to offend anybody. And I don't want us to be presumptuous. Oh, it's all coming down. No, we've got this information. We're not having to go off to, well, I know a guy who gives me insider information. No, this is all open source material. It's all out there. We've got to pay attention. Excuse me. Okay. And here's some speculation. Talk about that. This is from yesterday, February the 22nd, open source intel regarding what we could be seeing. 2018, Trump leaves the JCPOA Iran nuclear deal. 2020, Trump eliminates the IRGC top commander, Qasem Soleimani. 2025, Trump bombs Fordo and other Iranian nuclear sites. That's Operation Midnight Hammer. And now here we are, 2026. Trump sends 2 aircraft carriers to the Middle East with around 450 aircraft. This massive military buildup is not for show. Right. Okay. This is serious. This is very, very, very serious. All right. So here's some more response to the Tucker Carlson, Mike Huckabee interview. This is from Ian Miles Cheong on X. He's a very popular commentator. And here's the clip, 1 minute, 40 seconds, about the promise of the land to Abraham. Now, his commentary here is from Ian Miles Cheong. There is no missing context from Mike Huckabee's hyper-religious remarks about how it would be fine if they took all that are missing from his interview from Tucker Carlson, in which he asserts his belief that Israel has the right to lay claim to the entire Middle East. And here, Cheong concludes, Trump needs to fire Mike Huckabee and put in his place someone who isn't a hyper-religious zealot, or at least find someone who doesn't give ill-advised interviews. Okay, and Cheong is generally conservative. But yeah, Mike Huckabee, what is your interpretation of the actual borders of the Promised Land? So this is something we've brought up before. We will doubtlessly have to bring it up again. The next post is from the Wasson Watch Company on X. Some of you all are familiar with the Wasson Watch Company. They're very pro-Israel. I don't have a Wasson watch. This is a cheap Timex $60 watch I got a couple years ago. But they're very pro-Israel, and that's appreciable. But here, they get it wrong. You've all seen this map before. No, not the entire Middle East, just this part. But yeah, that's basically a huge chunk of the Middle East. And frequently, it is concluded from various interpretations of Genesis, well, it's from the Euphrates River, right, to the Great Sea. And so a number of interpreters conclude that all of this territory surrounded in red are the borders of the Promised Land. Okay? There are many in biblical studies who would say, no, you have interpreted this incorrectly. First of all, just from the standpoint of, here you have Kuwait. Well, what city was located in this vicinity right here? Ur of the Chaldees, right? Where Abraham originated. Why would Abraham have to leave his home to go to a land he had never seen when within the apparent borders of the Promised Land would include his home? Why couldn't God have just said, I'm giving you this land and I'm going to give you much more land to the west here? He would not have done that. But what commonly gets overlooked is that the Euphrates River goes all the way up into Syria. And so frequently, biblical interpreters, you can go look at a reliable, conservative biblical map, they will conclude that, yes, while the borders of the state of Israel right here, founded in 1948, are not the biblical borders of the Promised Land. And yes, the biblical borders of the Promised Land would include more territory. It would basically be like 2 or 3 times the size of Israel, going up into, yes, Syria, parts of Lebanon, parts of Jordan, parts of Egypt, but it would not be this right here, because this right here You pass this along, you are, whether you realize it or not, number one, you are promoting what I believe is an inaccurate interpretation, a fundamentalist interpretation of the biblical borders of Israel. And number two, you're going to be fomenting anti-Semitism, because all these anti-Semites, from whether they're Islamicists or whether they are the white nationalists, Christian nationalists, are going to say, see, Israel is a danger to the human race. And if the state of Israel continues, we're going to have some kind of a species ending event. Okay. So yes, the biblical borders of Israel, they're larger than the state of Israel. But why would Abraham ever have been told to leave his homeland and go to a country he had not seen, when the promised land apparently would have included his homeland? And remember, geographically, the Euphrates goes all the way up into Syria. So yes, it would be more like this. Just draw a large oval around the current state of Israel, and you have something larger than the state of Israel, but you don't have this huge chunk of the Middle East. That is just crazy. And yes, I've seen that map posted at different Messianic functions, and I have challenged people, and I've been pushed back, and I've been told things like, oh, well, you have a cemetery degree. I'm like, you don't understand how to read a map. All right, so here's more. This is from the Kuwait Times on Instagram. It would be fine if they took it all. U.S. envoy claims Israel has biblical right over Middle East. Okay, so here you have an Arab news source acknowledging that Mike Huckabee holds to the fundamentalist interpretation of the biblical borders of Israel. Yeah, this is going to get a lot of backlash from a lot of people. And look, yes, the biblical borders of Israel are larger than the current state of Israel, but it's not, the Middle East or even half the Middle East. And there have been plenty of people who have said, look, I support Israel, I support the biblical borders, but I can't support this. All right. From Visegrad 24, this is from yesterday, the 22nd of February. Khamenei chooses successors to manage the Islamic regime in case of his assassination. The leader of the Islamic regime in Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has reportedly designated his senior advisor, Ali Larijani, I hope I pronounced that properly, to handle key state affairs in the event of his demise. So what does that tell you? If this is at all accurate, he knows that he could be taken out at any time. And what orders, secret protocols, whatever it is he extending to his inner circle right now? Okay, back to the Mike Huckabee interview. CBN News. Huckabee schools Tucker on the Jewish biblical connection, and I generally agree with that. You all can look at some of this, but yeah, Christian media. Now here it talks, this is mainly the X post from Ambassador Huckabee referencing Nick Fuentes, referencing the Khazar theory, and some other things which are that we do agree on. But yeah, this is huge. This is absolutely huge. And in a general sense, I mean, I can disagree with people on the biblical borders of Israel, but yeah, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism are becoming more and more in vogue. And the Messianic community cannot afford to put its head in the sand, to hide under its bed, to hide in the closet, however you want to describe that, and act like this is all just going to dissipate. Okay, so here's a big one. This is from Joel Webbin. This came across my social media feed last night. I thought I'd pass this along. Joel Webbin is someone who identifies as a hyper supersessionist. Okay. And he believes God is finished with Israel, is finished with the Jewish people. Joel Webbin is influencing a lot of young men who they think that Western society has been corrupted by feminism. It's been corrupted by immigration from other countries. Islamicization, but it's also been corrupted by the Jews, right? And I got in the mail, I have not really looked at it that much, but I got in the mail this book called The Hyphenated Heresy. I referenced this a couple of weeks ago. And why did I get it? Yes, it was on my Amazon wish list, but I got an Amazon, credit in the mail, email. So I said, okay, I can go get it now. I'm not willing to pay full price, but I'll pay, the $5 or $6 difference. From what I've seen here, a huge amount of what he talks about involves, various statements in the Talmud. He goes after the Jewish Kabbalah, the mystical tradition, and indeed, he says that. Oh, he also has a chapter. I'm not making this up. Chapter 5 is called The Problem with Messianic Judaism. You might be able to see that on the screen. But this is the kind of stuff we have got to be aware of as today's Messianic community. And while there is a theological component of, well, we need to fight supersessionism, we need to fight replacement theology, but we're also going to get into some things which are very uncomfortable, like, what do you do about Kabbalah? What do you do about the mystical tradition? There are people in Messianic Judaism who think the Kabbalah is fine and that we can glean things from it. There are others who think it's straight from hell. I don't think I'm leaving you in suspense regarding the side I take. And what are we going to do? Now, somebody like Joel Webbin, people who lob onto him, they're gone. But what about some of the people in your Messianic congregation? You're going to keep them ignorant of what's going on? Or are you going to inform them as to, yeah, we know there's some things out there. Right now, as it involves different ministry projects and assignments, I'm working on, as quickly as I humanly can, updating our 1 Corinthians for the practical Messianic commentary that will then follow with 2 Corinthians and Hebrews. And hopefully we'll also be working on a Sermon on the Mount commentary. That's been a file that's come and go for a number of years now. Also working on the combined Salvation on the Line, volumes 1 and 2. But after that, after some of those things get completed, I definitely want to spend more free time on composing frequently asked questions entries. Down the road, will I be released to do my own treatment of replacement theology, how we handle it internally, how we handle it externally? I don't know. That might just be a bunch of FAQs, though. So it takes a while for somebody like me to sort through some of the arguments of something like this, the hyphenated heresy. But we want you to be aware that we know about this, and we're going to keep tabs on it the best we can. But again, if your local Messianic congregational leadership isn't from time to time saying, hey, we know there's an anti-Semitism problem, it's insufficient for us to just pray for peace, protection of the Jewish people in Israel and their salvation. No, we know the tide has turned post October the 7th. We know things are getting more complicated. And we're here if you have questions or concerns. We got to do that. And if they're not doing that, that's why we went 5 times a week with Messianic Insider. Okay? Now, a few more stories, 5, and then we will conclude. This is from the New York Times on X yesterday, 3:40. Breaking news: President Trump told advisors he would consider a larger attack on Iran if diplomacy or a targeted strike failed to deter its nuclear program. So, we know that President Trump has got a lot of potential options at his disposal, and that is something which can change definitely from day to day. Now, here's one. This is also within the sphere of influence of anti-Semitism. This came across my feed on X yesterday. This is from February the 21st. There's a 1-minute, 52-second clip from Newsmax. You can watch this in its entirety, but Newsmax: Christians, your foundation is Judaism, your savior is Israel. Okay, that's kind of an extrapolation, but basically this had to do with how Western civilization has a Jewish foundation, then Christ, the Messiah, Christianity, obviously, and then the United States of America. And the conclusion of this X channel is: imagine dictating theology to millions of believers to serve a foreign political agenda. Okay, so whether it's Joel Webbin or whether it's this person saying this is Zionist propaganda and we need to see it stopped. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that's Zionist propaganda. But, right now, because of the charged environment in which we live, a conservative news agency like Newsmax, which is going to say, look, Christianity's got a Jewish foundation to it. Various people on the right, Christian nationalists, etc., they're going to say that's Zionist propaganda. We need to stop this. And then, of course, it feeds into a lot of things I just talked about regarding the hyphenated heresy. Is it really Judeo-Christian or is it Christian? Because the church is the true Israel. I just saw someone who was an individual who contributed a lot early on to pro-Namian Christianity, who said that, the religion of the Bible, even the Old Testament, was Christianity, even though it wasn't called Christianity. It's not Judaism. And notwithstanding the ongoing development of pro-Namianism or pro-Namian Christianity, whatever it becomes, that's a person whose name was associated with a number of pro-Namian books, by the way, who is capitulating to this right-wing Christian nationalist, anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish agenda. And no, I'm not involved with pro-Namian Christianity, and we'll discuss that on Thursday in our One Law, One Torah series. Okay, 3 more. From Open Source Intel. This is from yesterday, 5:11 p.m. Ynet report. Israeli officials expressed surprise and frustration after the Trump administration set a third round of indirect nuclear talks with Iran in Geneva, calling it a last diplomatic chance after 2 failed rounds. So one rumor is that, or not rumor, but one piece of information out there is that we're going to see another round of nuclear talks in Geneva coming up at the end of the week. We'll see what happens. Of course, we also know that Marco Rubio is supposed to go to Israel within the week, by the end of the week. Okay, Open Source Intel Defender, similarly, you can read all of it later, but Iran has indicated it is prepared to make major concessions in regards to its nuclear program in talks Thursday with the United States in return for the lifting of sanctions and recognition of its right to enrich uranium, as it seeks to prevent a future attack, a senior Iranian official told Reuters. And there's some more detail there. We'll see what happens. Are there going to be a third round? I mean, people plan to do things that then fall through the cracks, right? Or they fall apart, or they have to be changed because of new circumstances. All right. And with the Iranian situation, some of you all may be aware of this. It was all over social media this morning. So 2CTV posted this at 7:31 a.m. Mass text claims U.S. president, this is in Iran, is a man of action in alleged Iran hack. So people all over Iran got this text message: U.S. president is a man of action. Okay, what would that be communicating to the people of Iran? We know earlier that President Trump, in one of his social media posts on Truth Social, said that help is coming. Now the U.S. president is a man of action. That doesn't sound like we're going to try to have a diplomatic solution or cut a deal with the Islamic Republic. Of course, we can still be surprised. And that is why we have to continue to pray for peace in the Middle East. Now, my view is that if the Islamic Republic gets overthrown and there's a constitutional monarchy or democratic republic which replaces it, it will shift different players in the Middle East. Could we see, peace engulfing the Middle East, especially with this board of peace that President Trump has set up? It's possible, but it would only be for a season anyway. It'd only be for a season. It wouldn't be, something permanent, because the scriptures say in First Thessalonians, while they're saying peace and safety or peace and security, sudden destruction will come. But we don't know how long that period of peace could be. And that's why we continue to wait, monitor, and appeal to the Lord regarding the direction we would go. But we are living in very complicated times. There's a lot of things we could have discussed today, but we didn't. I know there's probably going to be some more responses and fallout to the Mike Huckabee interview with Tucker Carlson. Please be aware of these things. When I say, your Messianic congregation needs to be discussing this, you can't avoid it. I mean, how many things are all of us guilty of avoiding in our lives? I don't want to have that, birds and the bees talk with my teenage son, my teenage daughter. I don't want to have that discussion about my last will and testament and my funeral plans. I don't want to have that discussion about, when are you going to go get that thing on your back, as was my late father's issue, checked, and then would it have been too late? Would it not have been too late? We have an opportunity now, with information being the way it is. We know what's happening. It's not just hearsay. It's not just, rumor and innuendo. To be informed enough so as to not be caught off guard. And I suspect that there are people out there who we know and love and respect. Either they are hoping this will blow over, or they don't know what to do, or perhaps even worse, they're internally afraid right now. And this is the time when we should be appealing to our eternal God, who makes sure that, whether it is the planets in our solar system, making sure that they're just far enough away and close to the sun so they don't freeze or don't burn up, or whether it's the molecules at the subatomic level, our God who orchestrates the universe according to a very specific grand design, we have access to the infinite power of heaven, and we can turn to him for the answers. So that concludes our news roundup. Tomorrow, we'll be getting into sorting through the legalism with our series on one law or one Torah theology. As always, on behalf of Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. Please do consider signing up for a monthly $25 or $50 donation. It'll help us pay a bill here or a bill there for certain. If you have not, please do visit my website, messianicapologetics.net, where you can access a wide array of articles, frequently asked questions entries, back issues of Outreach Israel News. You can take a look at some back episodes of Messianic Insider, different McKee moment shorts, and generally speaking, take a look at our ministry adventures over the years. Be sure to give this episode a thumbs up or a heart. It will definitely help its exposure on social media. And please, if it was something you were blessed by, repost it to your various social media platforms. We will see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you, shalom, and take care.